Hello and welcome to the University of Law. In today's video we're going to be reviewing 40 Volume 2. Now this came out earlier this week. I listened to it on the day of release through the Big Finish app, and today it's arrived in the post. So I'll do a quick overview of the product itself and then I'll talk through the actual audio drama. So you can see on the front cover we've got a unit soldier. Now there are spoilers in this review, so switch off now if you haven't listened to the audio drama yet. We've got a unit soldier here. He has the Nestine mask on his face, which is part of the story in the war games that feature. We've got the Brigadier from the 5th Doctor era, so that Mordrin Undead era Brigadier. We've got Turlo, who features in the story. We've got the 5th Doctor, as played by Peter Davison, in the middle. We've got Tegan. We've got another unit soldier. We've got an Auton. We have got here the Master's TARDIS. It's taking the same form that it took during Terror of the Autons, which was his very first televised story with the Delgado Master, in which also featured the Autons. So there's quite a few callbacks to that, because obviously we've got the Brigadier from that era, the Autons, and also a callback to the Master's very first televised story. We've also got the Anthony Ainley Master at the top, making his debut in a Big Finish audio drama. I think before now we've only ever had the Ainley Master in 2 full cast dramas. It was hinted that he was in disguise in one of the Lost stories, and was it The Hollows of Time? I think it was. And then in the End of the Line, I believe it was called, the first story in the 6th Doctor Last Adventure box set, we did have the Master using an avatar in this sort of world between worlds junction, like a clapping junction of universes, and the Valiard was in that as well. But it was always the Ainley Master, but in another body. So because sadly Anthony Ainley passed away. So he's now portrayed by John Coleshaw, who obviously plays also Chameleon, the Brigadier, and the Ainley Master. I have to say, Chameleon I knew he could do brilliantly from that Chameleon trilogy that we got a few years ago. The Brigadier, he always plays amazingly. He even gets it right depending on the age of the Brigadier. He can play young Brigadier, he can play Sarah Jane Adventures era Brigadier, he can play 80s Brigadier. He just gets it right every time. And I believe he's currently done audio dramas with the 2nd Doctor, the 3rd Doctor, now the 5th. He's done them with the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th. So we've had 6 Doctors that he's currently done audio dramas with, and I'd hope at some point we see him with the 10th Doctor and the War Doctor, who never ever met the Brigadier on screen. So if I open it up, and this can be fiddly sometimes with these, I do love these slip covers, makes them extra special, but they can be very difficult to get open. I haven't actually opened this yet, so let's give this a go. I tend to squeeze it the top and give it a pull. On the back, just noticed we've got the front artwork, but it has been rendered in green with a green filter on. As with all the recent Big Finish box sets, it's a 3-disc set. All 3 discs are one story. It's a 6-parter. It's called The Autumn Infinity by Tim Foley, and directed wonderfully as always by Ken Bentley. So that's the slip cover there. We've got that off, and now we have got the main feature here. So we've got the same artwork front and back. We've got the copyright notices. Obviously there's quite a few characters like the Brigadier, the Autons, and that have to be referenced. And when you open it up, you have got disc 1, which has got an advert below it for 40 Volume 1. 40 Volume 2, we've got parts 1 and 2. Same artwork on the front. Let's put this disc back. There we go. We have then got a booklet inside. Let's see what artwork's in there. Oh yes, so this is a little blurb about the story. I've got this lovely picture of Peter Davison in his cupboard recording in lockdown. He's got his full Fifth Doctor outfit on with his script. So that is in there. And then if I open up the other side, we've got episodes 3 and 4 on disc 2, and episodes 5 and 6 on disc 3, with an advert for The Lost Resort and Wicked Sisters, that were 2 box sets that came out in late 2020. Actually, that was 21 and that was 2020. Ignore me. And they almost kind of pioneered the current format that we now have. So I'm going to pop that back in its slipcase so you can see what the physical product is like. I really enjoyed this story. If you've seen my retrospective on the Adric audio dramas, I did mention that 40 is set just after Fall to Doomsday. That was what was implied. However, we now realise that the Doctor who featured in 40 Volume 1 is actually a Doctor from an aborted timeline. So he was taken from that point in time. However, he never got returned there. So the 40 saga, as far as I'm concerned, all of it, both box sets, actually take place from the Doctor's perspective immediately before resurrection of the Daleks. Now, I've mentioned before about how Big Finish does a wonderful job with all eras of Doctor Who at being a little bit more in depth with the characters. That can be David Tennant characters, it can be William Hartnell characters. It deepens their arcs, and it really does it for the Fifth Doctor, especially in his last box set, because it really celebrated kind of the whole idea of Adric, and the fact that Adric's loss was a big deal, to the point that it was his final word was Adric. It also does a little bit with Turlough. It kind of, obviously, if this is set before Resurrection of the Daleks, which at the end it leads directly into Resurrection of the Daleks, Turlough obviously leaves not long after that, and he comes to terms with his past. There is a few lines around his sort of him referencing that. So whereas the first 40 volume was very much about the Fifth Doctor and Adric, this one's more about his companions, and Turlough, it definitely reflects on his sort of more shady past and where he's going. The Brigadier had been his teacher and kind of knows his background, and there's a few conversations between the two characters which really kind of goes in depth with that side of Turlough, and him reflecting, him preparing to confront his past. And obviously we know that that's coming up, it's foreshadowing. Something people talk about with the Resurrection of the Daleks is that Tegan, just out of the blue, decides that there's been too much death and she decides to leave. This story sets up why she makes that decision in Resurrection, so that's a lovely little payoff for people who are fans of this era. In terms of Chameleon, it gives him a little role ahead of his sort of final end in Planet Fire, which is obviously where Turlough leaves as well, but at the same time it doesn't diminish the amazing character arc that he got recently in his main range trilogy. In terms of the Master, as I've said, there's some nice callbacks to the fact that he's worked with the Autons before. There's some really nice lore with the Autons, just some new elements. Obviously, there's always been that reference to them being from the old times, and it really kind of delves into that in a way that I've never experienced before with these characters, and that was just a wonderful, wonderful depth to the Autons. I thought, with it having 6 parts, it never ever sagged at any point. And there was just so much lore building in there. It was so enjoyable the whole way through, and it just kept you listening and had wonderful payoff. It pays off beautifully why the Fifth Doctor had been going through his timeline. There's 2 Doctors essentially in the story. There's the current Doctor just before Resurrection, and also the Doctor who's been lifted from shortly after Fall to Doomsday. So that was really enjoyable. The fact is, from the Doctor's perspective, he can't send this Spirit Doctor back simply because he knows that Doctor will change the past with Adric, and he knows full well that he'd do it himself. So that kind of explores his character again. There's also a reflection on the fact that the Fifth Doctor, wherever he's been, he always sees Tegan. Tegan is his constant, and yet at the end there's that twist where he meets Perry at the very end. So it does celebrate every single Fifth Doctor companion. Perry features at the very, very end, which was a lovely surprise cameo, and it kind of gives sort of hope that the Fifth Doctor can live beyond those initial companions that he had. yeah, so in terms of the master, it explores the monsters that he's worked with before, and as I've said, the lovely reference to previous adventures. There's also a lovely exploration between the Brigadier and the Master, and it really shows how the Brigadier as a character has developed since his young days when he'd blow anything up. Now he's retired, and it really kind of it goes through that shift in the Brigadier's character from kind of being that sort of young soldier to an elder statesman. So there's a really lovely shift, beautifully played by John Coleshaw. And also, he kind of mentions that years ago he'd have chased the Master to the ends of the earth, and now he's not going to bother. And in doing so, the Master kind of falls to his apparent death. But obviously, as we always know with the Ainley Master, he always seems to survive, and we know he comes back. Two stories later, well, 2 televised stories later, there's a few Turlo adventures in the middle, but a few adventures later he returns in Planet of Fire, where again he dies forever only to return in later instalments. But as I said, it's a lovely 6-part story. Sometimes 6-parters can drag. This does not drag at any point. It's constantly changing setting, but there's lots of character development. It's a real celebration in a way that does something new and fresh, whilst at the same time being faithful to the source material, and nothing feels out of place. Every new twist, every new revelation, every new piece of lore that is imparted really does feel right for the characters, right for the story, just right for Doctor Who. So an absolute 10 out of 10. Well done, Big Finish, on this whole 40 saga. Well done to all the actors, directors, sound designers, everyone involved, and writers especially. I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely worth picking up 40 if you can. And if you haven't already, make sure you listen to 40 Volume 1 first. Hope you enjoyed this video, and look forward to speaking to you soon.